So I had this video, The Curse of Non-Belonging, which is like, being an outsider your whole life and kind of how to start to rectify that pattern and how that pattern builds and creates all this momentum, right? And then you end up like this radical outcast, and you never really wanted that, right? Nobody deep down really wants that. On a biological level, nobody wants that. Even if they're pretending it's cool and rebellious, nobody wants that. So I made this video and it hit home for a lot of people. It got like a lot of attention. And there were all sorts of comments. Like I eventually stopped going through them because there was just so many. But one of the things that people had like a lot of questions. Like, how do you actually come out of this pattern? How do you actually, whatever it is, feel differently about yourself or make friends or whatever? It was in a little bit of a different headspace when I made that. That was a while ago. But in the video, I talk about authenticity, being more of yourself. Don't be afraid of the angry mob with the pitchforks. Be all of yourself. The more you do that, the more you will very naturally come into contact with people who are like you, who accept you, who are supportive of you, right? Versus hiding yourself and staying in this shame place where you are more likely to just keep bumping up against, all these assholes who don't respect you or see you or understand you, etc. So I still stand by that. I still think that's a good technique or tactic for dealing with this issue, because when people are outcasts, I think that they naturally go into hiding. And so instead of just always being in that shame, hiding, it's very low energy, it's very disempowering. You can't get shit done when you're in that state. So it's better to like try to grow a pair and just start showing up as yourself little by little. It doesn't have to be perfect, and just start practicing that. And then you start to be able to actually show up as yourself more and more. A bigger percentage of you starts coming out and seeing that it's okay, and seeing that even when someone hates your guts, it's okay, like training your nervous system out like that. I still stand by that. Still think that's a good strategy, and that it's something that a lot of people need to do based on where they're at emotionally. However, I will say, fun fact, because I saw some comments of people saying like this will never happen, or like I tried your technique and everyone still rejects me, it didn't work, and like all this scary stuff of like it, a lot of like negative stuff. People who don't typically watch this channel, I think, just showing up in the comments and saying like, there's no point of me being alive, like I should just give up, everyone hates me. All this really, really negative stuff. And another thing I want to say on this topic of not belonging, feeling like an outcast, you don't have to, because your identity is so steeped in this at this point. If you're saying things like that, like your identity is steeped in not belonging. You've had that experience your whole life. To ask you to make a shift into being and feeling like an insider and just naturally fitting in, it's a really big jump. That's a really hard jump. You don't have to do that. You don't have to radically change your identity to become an insider. So what I've noticed as someone who's been honestly an outsider, at least where I live, my whole entire life, is that the idea of becoming an insider has a lot of negative, scary connotations. It actually makes me feel like I would lose myself and lose my genuine identity to become an insider. So there's all this resistance to that, and that's probably not really how my life is going to play out. Realistically, practically, it's probably not going to happen that I become this revered, respected insider of the mainstream world, right? Like, it's probably not going to happen. I don't have high hopes. I'm not holding out for that. But the thing that people are missing here is the connotation. So you have that identity, you're an outsider, right? The connotation that you've attached to that. What are the things you associate with being an outsider? Are they negative or are they positive, right? If they're negative, then you've solidified yourself in a shame-based identity. That's what we talk about in that video, shame-based identities. You will naturally sync up with other people who are ashamed of themselves. Not necessarily because you're authentically connected to that person in some true way. You're just matching up with other people who are ashamed of their identities, right? Here's the kicker that I think people miss. You don't have to have a negative connotation with being an outsider. In fact, you can have a really positive, really exciting, really fascinating definition of what an outsider is. You've just been given a negative one because of your emotional experiences in the past. So when you start to change that connotation and start to put a lot of positive associations with what it is to be an outsider, you can actually feel a lot better about being it, and then you can inhabit that role in a social context in a very positive way. So this is something that I was able to do through learning psychology. I started to learn about different types of people, different personalities, how statistically there are more likely to be people who are not like me. That's just the way it is. Statistically, there are more personalities that are not like me than there are that are like me, right? That's just a basic fact that has been discovered in the realm of psychology. Second thing, right? Sensitivity. I am further on the spectrum of high sensitivity than most of the people that I've encountered in my life. And I know that just from talking to them and hearing about their lives and their health and their experiences. I can tell, just based on the people I've known, again, just statistically, that most of them are probably less sensitive than I am, physically and emotionally. So when you start to look at like demographics, you can see how your status as an outsider is just statistic. It has nothing to do with anything shameful or fundamentally broken about you. Now, again, in my experience, there is probably some grief to process because your life is very different when you're an outsider in the culture that you were brought up in. You don't have that typical, easy, traditional experience of just never wondering anything, never having to think like, why is this different for me? Why, So there is, again, in my experience, there was kind of like a grieving of like, look how it could have been, but it wasn't like that. I would look at people who were very much insiders, having a very different experience, and I would be envious. Not completely, because there are definitely some downsides to being an insider, but a little bit of envy there and some grief. So again, when you start to process all that shame and guilt and grief and whatever is coming up, you can move out of that. You can get sick of that and be like, okay, I'm done. I've processed it. And then you can start to rewrite what it means to be what you have been, right? You don't have to radically transition identities because that's a very difficult process and it's very disorienting. People don't talk about like the amount of anxiety that comes up for people when they're like transitioning out of an identity, even if it's negative. So if that's too hard and you don't see any way that you could do that, don't worry about doing that. Just change your definition of what it means to be what you already are. So through learning, like I said, learning psychology, learning about how the body works, especially for physically sensitive people, I naturally started to transition out of that shame and out of like that really, really dense negative association just by learning facts about reality, right? Because your shame and your guilt and your grief and your sadness, it's not giving you facts. It's just giving you past experience and past emotions and momentum that you've built with that identity that says there's something wrong with you, is usually the crux of it. There's something wrong with you. Once you learn that there's technically nothing wrong with you, it alleviates a lot of that pain. That is like step one, like taking yourself out of this shame spiral, because it's complicated. It's like, okay, the first thing, so when I'm working with someone and I can just see in their body language, they have a lot of shame, and maybe they were like one of the people who didn't really belong in their family, or the black sheep or whatever. It creates this aura around a person where it's shame is really what it is. So the first thing I do in that situation is I start explaining to someone that it's the culture, right? So there's more to this though. When you are constantly in a state of self-blame, there's something wrong with me, it's my fault, blah blah blah, it is a step up energetically for you to move toward the idea of the culture is at fault. It's not me, it's the culture. It was my upbringing, it was the school system, it was capitalism, like anything where we can understand it from the context of it wasn't me, it was the system that I was in. That is a step up energetically, because when we're in that intense, like, I'm broken inside, that's the bottom, that's the worst you can feel, is shame, really. So when we move up a stage, we go into blame, like it's your fault, right? It's everybody else's fault. The problem is we see, so a lot of wise people, I notice, who are aware that they are kind of in control of their life and it's their responsibility. A lot of people like that, I feel like, get stuck in the shame and guilt and like it's my fault. So they might need reminders that it's actually not so much their fault. Then we have the people, this is like a fun trend nowadays. We've got the people who are very in the habit of blaming everything outside of them, can't take any personal responsibility. And so for those people, they actually need more of a reality check that no, in fact, these things that are happening in your life are not happening because the government and your school system that you grow up in and your parents and, maybe they set you up to fail on some level. But to continue putting that blame out is stunting your growth really drastically. So whatever the issue is that we're dealing with, even if it's not the belonging thing that we just talked about, we have to kind of gauge where we're at. Are we continuously blaming ourselves and shaming ourselves and feeling like everything is our fault and our responsibility? That's more from this realm of religious conditioning, of like puritanical, you're supposed to be better, you're supposed to be perfect, it should have been better. People who got a heavy dose of that are likely to struggle with that. And so they need to be reminded that they didn't do shit and they're fine and it's somebody else's fault. Don't worry about it. So they can climb out of that hole. And then we've got the people who really need a good dose of reality check in understanding that they have agency and that if things are going wrong in their life, maybe it's time to take a look at that agency that they've been brushing off and saying like, I don't have any control.